The air over Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the morning of June 14, 1943, was electrified by sheer, unrelenting terror. Dawn broke not over debris from high explosives, but over something far more insidious. The streets, parks and rooftops were strewn with small, thick-walled 2 kilos SD2 butterfly bombs. 2,500 of the deadly devices lay scattered, each waiting for the slightest disturbance. Lieutenant Eric Wakeling felt a primal fear, the kind that made the hair literally stand up on the back of his neck. This sensation was shared by every man who had to crawl through that landscape of potential death. These were not random duds. These weapons were designed by German experts with one purpose: to kill the British bomb disposal officers. The SND-2s were armed by a drogue upon descent, featuring an airburst fuse. They had already claimed dozens of civilian and civil defense lives, people killed simply because a bomb was kicked, or ridden over by bicycles and cars. Wakeling had to move with impossible, agonizing slowness, knowing that one small movement could trigger a premature explosion. He recalled an instant where he needed to get just 1 inch from a 2-kilogram bomb to disarm it. He was saved only by an automatic reaction that allowed him to dive for cover milliseconds before the blast blew out windows and sent shrapnel ripping through the air. Every single unexploded bomb held up the war effort, but these anti-personnel mines held up life itself. The bomb disposal officers were engaged in a lonely war. They pitted their specialized expertise against an enemy whose ingenuity was solely focused on their destruction. The scale of the threat necessitating this lonely vigil was staggering. Over the course of the war, they would deal with 45,441 bombs. They would also handle 6,983 anti-aircraft shells and more than 300,000 beach mines. This was the brutal, unseen front line on the home front, but long before the mud and shrapnel of Grimsby, there was the ambition that put Wakeling there. Eric Wakeling had volunteered for bomb disposal, driven by a youthful desire to become an army officer. He believed this role offered greater opportunity and purpose than the less vital chemical warfare units, which had been hastily formed after the perceived threat of gas warfare in the First World War. His decision, however, marked the beginning of what he later described as the worst 3 years of his life. The foundation was laid at the Army Technical School in Chepstow. This was a period of rigorous, disciplined training, characterized by early mornings and square bashing. Living conditions were stark, forcing soldiers to look after themselves on a meagre shilling a week. This formative period, filled with punishment details like late-night parades, was a shocking contrast to his happy upbringing. As a boy, his biggest worries were earning the whack from his headmaster for sliding down banisters or causing parental distress by swimming around the pier. Early army life also forced him into disliked sports like boxing, leading to injuries. He endured a brief chaotic stint in the Officer Training Corps band, where his initial struggles with the flute quickly relegated him to the drums. He carried the grudges and resilience forged in this fire. He recalled a particular dislike for an early sergeant whom he vowed to make miserable, only to find the man outranked him later in the war. Upon commissioning as a Royal Engineer in June 1940, Wakeling's journey continued, often marked by frustration with administrative postings and a persistent hunger for active duty. The war effort, however, was immense, and the need for bomb disposal officers was desperate. When he arrived at No. 3 Bomb Disposal Company headquarters in Nottingham, the setting was far from the polished professionalism he might have expected. Instead of a smart notice board, he found a large, decrepit Victorian house at the end of a slight incline. The corporal's welcome was grimly realistic, an offer of bacon and fried bread and a casual directive to the nearest pub. This was no country club. Major J.R.F. McCartney, a George Medal recipient commanding the company, confirmed the dire straits. He noted the company had not stopped working since its formation. Wakeling was privy to the chilling statistic that the life expectancy of a subaltern in bomb disposal at that time was a mere 10 weeks. The inherent danger was brutally illustrated by the experience of No. 9 Bomb Disposal Company in Birmingham. 4 officers were transferred in, and after just 17 days, only 2 returned. 2 officers and their section sergeants were killed. This grim statistic underscored the brutal truth. No other branch of the army was required to keep its officers and men in the firing line, every day, for the whole of the war. If a bomb disposal officer was killed, the war effort simply ground on. Often, nobody missed him. He was just another casualty in the unseen war against the German experts, whose escalating ingenuity demanded specialized training and tools. Complex fuses like the Y and the 57 required everything from the primitive Polish mine detector to the sophisticated high-pressure water jetting system. This was a desperate attempt to stay one step ahead of oblivion. The initial weeks of Eric Wakeling's commission were defined by the chaotic reality of the job, a grim contrast to the idealized military structures he had trained for. He arrived at Section 42 in Cossington, his head spinning around with the information he had been force-fed at headquarters. He quickly found that the true command lay not with him, but with the men who lived and breathed the earth. Sergeant Clark, a regular army sapper whose experience in tunneling and bomb disposal dwarfed any textbook knowledge, was the indispensable core of the section. Wakeling quickly deferred to Clark and his fellow officer Ross Britton, recognizing that the theoretical knowledge of a newly commissioned subaltern was worthless compared to the practical expertise of the non-commissioned officers. He was, in effect, very much on his own, relying completely on the seasoned eyes around him. The work began with observation, watching Ross deal with the endless stream of unexploded ordnance. The bombs were categorized, Category A demanding immediate removal at all costs, and Category B requiring a 4-day waiting period. Then the call came for his first personal defusal. The externalized fear vanished, replaced by a sudden internal spasm. Ross presented the challenge bluntly. "All right, Eric. Let's see you do this one all on your own." It was a 50-kilogram bomb, 110 pounds of metal, half of it high explosive. That was enough to blow 3 houses to eternity. As he descended into the shaft, the mud sucking at his boots, Eric's fingers were trembling. He worked the specialized tools, the Crabtree fuse discharger, the fuse keys. Every movement was a prayer against booby traps, against premature detonation. The tension was a physical thing, tightening his chest until the locking ring finally turned free. When the fuse was out, a silly, relieved grin broke through the mud and sweat. Ross handed him the inert metal cylinder. "You had better keep that fuse as a souvenir of your first job." The adrenaline crashed, and the reaction set in. He needed a drink, a moment of silence, anything to absorb the brutal truth that he had just wrestled with death and won. Success, however, bred a lethal complacency. The methodical digging quickly became routine. It was a grueling cycle of shaft sinking, often 7 or 8 feet down into atrocious ground that was sometimes like running sand or thick, watery mud. The sheer volume of work 10 unexploded bombs found in a single stick at Burstall normalized the danger. By the time the disposal team reached the 10th device, the procedure had become mechanical. Eric measured the offset, calculated the central point for the next shaft, and then descended. He was working by rote, taking for granted that this fuse, like the previous 9, would be a standard number 2S impact device. In his inexperience, he failed to adequately examine the fuse pocket. The device he faced was a half-ton monster, buried deep, armed the moment it left the plane. Its real danger lay in the clockwork long-delay mechanism, designed to detonate up to 90 hours after impact. This mechanism, no bigger than a wristwatch, was insidious, often restarting its countdown with the slightest vibration from the digging. Eric had the small booster charge in his hand, ready to remove it. He had been slipshod, rushing the final moments of the job.
Then came the sound.
A sharp, violent crack erupted from the fuse he was holding, immediately followed by a blinding flash of flame. Time stopped. The noise was localized and intimate, right in his hand. A searing heat licked his skin. He instantly dropped the gain, scrambling backward, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, stuttering rhythm. For a moment he was paralyzed by the realization of what had occurred. The primary detonating mechanism had gone off. Not the main charge, but the initial sequence designed to set off the high explosive. He was still alive, his hands miraculously intact, though cold sweat broke out across his body as they trembled uncontrollably. He looked down at the fuse head, black and scarred, smoking faintly. He had been terrifyingly lucky that his hands had not been in the direct line of the minuscule, localized explosion. The clockwork mechanism had almost certainly been running, its timer ticking down while he worked inches from oblivion. Had the primary detonation occurred moments earlier, while the fuse was still seated in the bomb casing, the main charge would have followed instantly. The consequences would have been, as he later understood with chilling clarity, personally disastrous. This was not a near miss caused by German ingenuity, but by his own fatal lapse. He had failed to follow standard procedure, allowing the familiarity of the job to lull him into a deadly error. The flash and the crack of the 10th bomb was a brutal, immediate lesson. The BDO was the battlefield, and meticulous procedure was the only barrier between him and death. From that instant on, the routine was abandoned. Every single fuse would now be treated as the most dangerous device ever encountered. The education of Lieutenant Eric Wakeling had just begun, and the tuition fee was nearly his life. The flash and the crack of the 10th bomb was a brutal lesson, but it was just the beginning of the technical arms race that defined the BDO's existence. The German designers were not static. Their ingenuity was relentless, constantly developing insidious new ways to kill the men tasked with neutralizing their ordnance. The introduction of the long-delay fuses, particularly the number 17, necessitated a complete overhaul of protocols. These clockwork mechanisms, designed to detonate up to 90 hours after impact, could paralyze the British war effort for days. The need to maintain vital production tanks for the Desert War. Aircraft components meant that bomb disposal officers were frequently forced to classify these delayed action devices as Category A, demanding immediate high-risk disposal regardless of the danger. This battle of wits escalated dramatically with the discovery of the Y fuse. It was a clear, calculated attempt to murder the disposal crews. The Y fuse was a deliberate anti-handling device containing 3 mercury switches and small batteries. It was designed to detonate the main charge if the bomb was tilted, rotated, or moved even slightly during extraction. Traditional methods of immunization, like draining the electrical charge, were now dangerously ineffective. Then the urgent call came at 3 a.m. A Category A1 bomb had landed deep inside a factory producing crucial components. The urgency was absolute. Detonation was unthinkable in this location. Wakeling and his section sergeant arrived to find the bomb buried deep beneath the fractured factory floor. The smell of disturbed earth mingled with the metallic tang of the production line. The initial reconnaissance was grim. The bomb had to be disarmed in situ. "Start rabbiting," Wakeling ordered, his voice low, the grim-faced sergeant relaying the instruction. "But be bloody careful," he warned. "We need to reach that first fuse as fast as possible." The digging squad worked in shifts, meticulously clearing the earth, often using only trowels. They knew that every inch brought them closer to the ticking heart of the device. Wakeling constantly monitored the shaft, the silence of the factory amplifying the sound of scraping metal and labored breathing. Finally, they reached the tail. Wakeling descended into the confined space, the claustrophobia pressing in on him. He cleared the last of the clay from the fuse head, using the beam of his torch. The sight of the brass mechanism confirmed his dread. It was the number 17. The clockwork was ticking, and it was loud. There was nothing he could do to stop the countdown manually. The sergeant, stationed above, saw the look on the officer's face and instantly understood the gravity. He kept the ticking sound to himself, unwilling to break the concentration of the men digging nearby. "It's running, Sarge," Wakeling whispered up the shaft, his voice tight. "Get the clock stopper ready and bring it down." The clock stopper was a cumbersome piece of equipment, a specialized tool designed by the British engineers to fight the number 17. It had to be carefully maneuvered into the confined fuse pocket, a task made impossibly difficult in the dark, restricted shaft. Wakeling's hands, though steady from intensive concentration, felt huge and clumsy as he tried to align the heavy device. The ticking was a hammer blow inside his skull. Tick, tick, tick. He moved with agonizing precision, every muscle screaming against the need for slowness. If the clock stopper slipped, if it jarred the fuse, the factory and everyone in it would cease to exist. He felt the cold metal seat against the fuse head, locked it down, and activated the mechanism designed to freeze the clockwork. They waited, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than the half-ton bomb beneath them. Then the ticking stopped. A profound physical wave of relief washed over Wakeling. He looked up at the sergeant, a shared, exhausted laugh bubbling up from the stress they had just endured. "Not bad, eh, sir?" the sergeant said, leaning over the shaft opening. "Less than 18 hours to kill the bugger. Mind you," he added, "it's not over, but at least we know that it won't blow up the factory." The bomb, now neutralized, was extracted using a trolley and sheer legs. But the narrow escape underscored the constant pressure. The British engineers were fighting the German engineers, and the BDO was the proving ground. This relentless technical escalation necessitated formalized training. The ad hoc methods learned in the field had to be codified and disseminated immediately. The Army Bomb Disposal School was established, marking a significant turning point in the war against ordnance. Wakeling, already a lieutenant, was posted to the Bomb Recce School in Leeds, shifting from immediate danger to the crucial task of disseminating knowledge. The training was demanding, covering everything from the primitive Metox receiver and the Polish Mine Detector to the specialized Merrilees fuse extractor. It also delved into the intricacies of the Y fuse. Wakeling quickly found his footing, despite his initial self-doubt about lecturing. His hard-won field experience made his words the gospel truth to his students, men who often felt more comfortable digging than marching. The scale of the instruction was enormous. Lecture audiences, drawn from the police, civil defense, and home guard, often reached 2,000 people. The school's bomb museum housed a comprehensive grim collection of ordnance, from 1 kilogram SC and SD bombs up to 500 kilogram variants. This collection served as a stark visual reminder of the destructive power they were learning to tame. The technical arms race forced the boffins to develop specialized equipment at a furious pace. The threat of the Y fuse and the later anti-withdrawal 57 fuse led to the creation of clear plastic BD dischargers. They began using freezing techniques, liquid oxygen or nitrogen, to render the mechanisms inert, a process that could take hours. They even utilized field photography, relying on radon to photograph the fuse internals. This constant innovation was the only thing standing between the bomb disposal officers and a brutal 10-week life expectancy. Wakeling now wore the iconic yellow bomb insignia with blue rings on a red background. This was the much-treasured symbol of the elite band of bomb disposers. The shift to instructing, however, did not mean an end to the soldiering life. At Tollerton Hall, a former country club turned training ground, he and his colleague Cliff Green established a brutal assault course. To instill a true sense of realism, a heaven help us mentality that acknowledged the stakes, Wakeling authorized the use of live explosives. Ammonol and gelignite were detonated beneath men crossing a stream. The gelignite exploded in the water, making it very difficult to retain your hold as the shockwave hammered their bodies. This intensive, realistic training, though physically and psychologically punishing, was the only way to prepare the next wave of officers for the grim reality. The fight against the German engineers was a daily, technical, and often fatal duel, where luck and expertise were the only allies. The war against the German boffins was a battle fought not with battalions, but with circuits, timing mechanisms, and sheer, agonizing patience. The escalating sophistication of enemy ordnance, the Y fuse, the 57 fuse, the long delay mechanisms, had been a relentless, grinding challenge. But nothing prepared the bomb disposal units for the sheer, overwhelming, and distributed horror of the anti-personnel campaign. The night of June 13, 1943, had been the turning point. A single, focused raid on Grimsby and Cleethorpes transformed the localized technical challenge of bomb disposal into a massive, desperate clearance operation. 2,500 SD-2 butterfly bombs had been scattered across the landscape. Each one was a 2-kilogram death trap designed to detonate upon the slightest touch. Now we return to that agonizing period described at the start, the moment when the hair literally stood up on the back of Eric Wakeling's neck. The sheer volume of ordnance had paralyzed the town. The bombs, thick-walled devices with an airburst fuse, were encountered everywhere. They lay in gardens, on rooftops, and scattered across the roads where they had already killed the unwary. Civilians and civil defense workers had simply kicked them or driven over them with cars and bicycles. The initial shock was the realization that this was not a matter of digging a single deep shaft. This was a war of meticulous, square-by-square clearance. New German fuses, the number 67 delayed action and the treacherous number 15, 70 booby trap, were being found in the devices, rendering standard procedures useless. The number 42, 3 Bomb Disposal Company Royal Engineers, had to issue crucial, updated instructions for searching and disposal just days after the raid. The work was a grueling green nightmare, not of depth, but of breadth. The officers, including Lieutenant Wakeling and his sergeant, had to crawl across the ground probing for the scattered devices. The psychological strain was immense. The highest priority had been assigned, where the death of a disposal officer was deemed an acceptable risk to the war effort. One afternoon, the call took Wakeling to a residential street, cordoned off by nervous police officers. A single SD2 was reported to be in a kitchen. He entered the house, the air thick with the dust of plaster and the acrid smell of high explosives. The bomb lay on the linoleum floor of a lovely room, all pink and feminine, a jarring contrast to the metallic ugliness. He had to get 1 inch from the device to begin the disarming sequence. He moved with impossible slowness, hands shaking only slightly, the fear internalized and channeled into focus. He successfully neutralized the fuse, but the bomb itself, a small potent metal cylinder still, had to be moved or destroyed. Deciding to detonate it in situ was the safer option for his men, but required elaborate preparations. He meticulously placed sandbags, building a small internal bunker around the device, attempting to contain the blast. He then retreated to the street, paying out the wire for the remote detonation. The explosion was sharp and violent. The windows on both sides of the house blew out instantly, showering the street with glass shards and wood splinters. Wakeling, instinctively diving for cover, felt the familiar, shocking concussive force. The sound was an immediate physical blow to his eardrums. He was saved by automatic reaction, the muscle memory honed by months of near-death experiences. The dive had been milliseconds before the shrapnel arrived. He picked himself up, brushing off the dust and fragments. The kitchen, though damaged, was structurally intact. The immediate task was done, but the work was endless. The sheer volume of unexploded ordnance meant that the clearance effort quickly shifted to other, larger threats discovered during the widespread searching. In Hull, a massive unexploded 1,000-kilogram bomb, codenamed Old Bill, had been located deep beneath the marketplace. This was a different kind of terror, a multi-year engineering project that would become the longest continuous effort in wartime bomb disposal history. The ground around Old Bill was treacherous. The bomb had landed, half-buried, and acted like a chute, throwing debris high into the air when other, smaller bombs detonated nearby. Locating it required 6 separate shafts and repeated failures. The initial methods, relying on the limited 2-foot depth of the old Polish Mine Detector, were useless. The unit needed the new ERA Mark I mine locator, capable of finding metal 6 feet below the surface. The tunneling began. The clay was the very devil to dig, sticky and unforgiving. Wakeling and his sergeant probed the earth, inch by agonizing inch, until they heard the inevitable, dreaded sound, the clank of metal on metal. The bomb was found, but the excavation was far from over. The work below ground was a claustrophobic nightmare. The diggers were constantly battling the high water table, utilizing aluminum pipes and pumps in a desperate attempt to lower the water level enough to expose the fuse pockets. The men were often shoveling thick soup, sinking up to their knees in watery mud. The soil behaved like running sand, or even soft blancmange. For days the men tunneled, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and fear. The psychological toll was profound. They drank bad coffee and yearned for sleep, knowing that any vibration, any lapse in shoring up the shaft, could bring the earth down on them. Worse, it could restart a long-delay fuse. The bomb disposal officers kept a constant listening watch for the telltale tick, tick, tick that would signal immediate catastrophe. Amidst this relentless technical danger, Brigadier Bateman, the director of bomb disposal from the War Office, visited the unit on June 16, 1943. He came to witness the scale of the crisis firsthand. He saw the systematic clearance, the painstaking efforts, and the individual acts of bravery that defined the response. Officer Gordon Jensen was tasked with a particularly gruesome job. He had to reach a bomb lodged in a 7-way sewer junction. The only way to reach the device was to remove foul-smelling sludge with a spoon. He worked in the filth, building elaborate defenses of straw bales to protect the surrounding buildings before remotely detonating the device. Jensen earned the George Medal for his efforts. This was a testament to the fact that heroism in this war was often measured in the ability to endure unimaginable squalor and proximity to death. The Grimsby crisis was eventually cleared in just over a week, freeing 2 towns from the pervasive threat. On the final day of clearance alone, the company dealt with 367 bombs. The scale of the operation, The 2,500 butterfly bombs, the 500-kilogram monsters, the meticulous tunneling underscored the truth. The bomb disposal officers were the unsung heroes of the home front. They were the men who ensured that the war effort and civilian life could continue, one agonizingly slow inch at a time. They fought against an enemy whose sole focus was their elimination. One bomb disposal man later recalled the townspeople's respect. After a dusty day clearing bombs, everyone in a crowded pub would stand up and offer them their seats. The war did not end when the sirens fell silent. It simply moved underground and onto the coastlines. The bomb disposal units, having survived the relentless aerial assault, now faced the lingering, insidious threats of unexploded ordnance and the massive, hastily laid minefields of 1940. This was the lingering war, fought against time, erosion, and the unseen volatility of aging explosives. The ground itself remained a treacherous enemy. Engineers excavating large unexploded bombs often battled unstable earth, particularly in built-up areas where the water table was high. In one instance, a protracted effort to dewater an area for a deep bomb recovery led to a bizarre and unsettling consequence. The removal of so much underground water caused the very foundations of a nearby house to begin shifting. The ground, destabilized by the absence of its subterranean fluid, was literally moving. The team had to contend not just with the bomb, but with the threat of collapsing civilian structures. Nowhere was the unseen danger more acute than along the British coastline. The minefields rushed into existence in 1940 across cliffs, sand dunes, and shingle were deteriorating rapidly. Environmental factors, salt, erosion, and shifting sands had degraded the complex mechanisms inside the mines. Devices like the B-type sea mine, which had initially required a substantial 50 pounds of pressure to detonate its bowspring, had become hypersensitive. Could these devices now be triggered by just a few pounds, such as the weight of a small dog? This grim reality was proven catastrophically in August 1944 at Redcar. Lieutenant Stewart and his sergeant were working through a section of the coastal field, marking boundaries with white tape, when a stray dog wandered onto the uncleared ground. The weight of the animal was enough. The resulting explosion was not isolated. The sympathetic detonation that followed was immense, triggering well over half the mines in the field in a terrifying chain reaction of earth, flame, and thunder. Lieutenant Stewart and his sergeant were killed instantly. A few months later, in November, Lieutenant Dobby, his sergeant, and a sapper met the same fate in a moving sand situation. They were swallowed by a field that seemed to reset its boundaries daily. The task of identifying the remains fell to officers like Lieutenant Harry Beckingham, a gruesome necessity that underscored the brutal, unglamorous reality of the lingering threat. The traditional, softly approach of manual clearance became untenable on shingle beaches, where mines could be swallowed up by the tide or buried too deep to locate reliably. The only answer was innovation. The shift in focus led to the establishment of specialized experimental units. After the war ended, the unit relocated to Shoreham, anticipating a cushy assignment. Instead, they found the work far more interesting and challenging than anticipated. Their primary task was to devise a method to clear the deadly shingle minefields without risking human life. Major Powell, the officer commanding, introduced the subalterns to the groundbreaking solution: high-pressure water jetting. The concept was brutally simple and effective. A converted Bren gun carrier, heavily armored and fitted with periscopes, housed the power source. This power came from Leyland engines driving Mather and Platt pumps, capable of delivering over 100 pounds per square inch of water pressure. The machine was driven to the edge of the minefield. The operator, safely inside the armored carrier, manipulated the jet's traverse and height using specialized controls. When the water jet hit the shingle, it worked like a surgical tool, stripping away the layers of sand and pebbles. The pressure was so immense, however, that it tended not merely to uncover the mine, but to explode it, neutralizing the threat without requiring a single man to set foot in the field. The sound of the modified carrier's engine roaring, followed by the focused, high-pitched whoosh of the water jet tearing into the earth, became the new sound of safety. The high-stakes work was continuous, leading to many VIP visits throughout the summer of 1945. Officers, working in shorts during fair weather, battled the sun, their skin peeling off from exposure. The camaraderie remained, forged in shared danger and mundane struggles, such as George Churchill, the MT officer, sticking to his ritual of smoking only 2 cigarettes a day. The unit's success was measured in the powerful controlled explosions that cleared the coastlines. Sometimes, however, there were unintended consequences. One officer, eager for efficiency, used 2 exploders to detonate the last 16 mines simultaneously. He discovered later that the powerful blast had blown in 40 windows of a country house over a mile away. This specialized work continued for 4 months after the formal cessation of hostilities. But the war machine was winding down. The unit faced demobilization and disbandment. Eric Wakeling, the young officer who had survived the 10-week life expectancy odds, was posted to the War Office for administrative duties. This was a profound, jarring contrast to the life-or-death intensity of the front line. He traded the sticky mud of the shafts for the polished floors of Whitehall. His daily routine became the mundane struggle of catching the 8:15 train, often late, and climbing the stairs to his 4th-floor office. This climb was necessary because post-war electricity shortages frequently shut down the lifts. He found himself wearing civilian clothes, feeling less like a soldier and more like a civil servant. The constant adrenaline, the desperate need for invention, was replaced by paperwork and bureaucracy. The transition from the front lines was a profound psychological shock. The immediate, visceral purpose of saving lives and infrastructure was gone. It was replaced by the administrative grind of demobilization and reorganization. He dreamed constantly of returning to the field, of commanding a company again. He longed for the promotion to major, the active command he believed he had earned. But the man who had pitted his wits against the German scientists and survived the anti-handling devices, the butterfly bombs, and the ticking clockwork fuses was now sitting behind a desk. He waited patiently for the lift to work. The war was over, but the soldier in him remained restless. He hoped his next posting would finally grant him the active command he craved. The legacy of their dangerous work, however, was secure. The coastal minefields, cleared by ingenuity and sheer bravery, ensured that the long, deadly shadow of the war was slowly, painfully lifted from British soil. The true cost of the war against the German fuses could not be measured in tonnage or territory gained. It was measured only in the lives of the men who fought it alone. 55 officers and 339 other ranks were killed. It was a sacrifice largely invisible to a public focused on the glamour of the air war or the sweep of the infantry campaigns. 13 George Crosses were awarded for this work. But for the men who had faced death every single day for the entire duration of the conflict, the recognition often felt insufficient. It was a bureaucratic slight against the daily peril they endured. The service itself evolved, shifting from bomb disposal, or BD, to explosive ordnance disposal, EOD. But the underlying truth remained constant. These men were an elite, tight-knit fraternity, forged by the shared, intimate knowledge of mortality. They were the ones who carried the constant awareness that if they were killed, they were hardly missed at all in the grand military machine, unlike the pilots whose deaths were instantly noted in the mess. The post-war years were marked by a slow, agonizing process of demobilization and reorganization. The bomb disposal regiments, the 137th, the 142nd, and the 144th were formed, and then, by 1967, they were disbanded. Their hard-won expertise was scattered across the globe. Eric Wakeling, Major C.H. Green, and their colleagues moved through the ranks. Some achieved the commands they had longed for. Others settled into the administrative quiet of peacetime. The years passed in a blur of civilian life, but the bond, forged in the claustrophobic darkness of shafts and the terror of ticking clocks, never broke. 50 years later, the debt remained unpaid. The opportunity for closure finally arrived in 1993. Wakeling, now a retired lieutenant colonel, led the effort to organize a reunion. The location was the town that had been the epicenter of their greatest, most chaotic challenge, Grimsby. The town, led by Mayor-Councillor Steve Norton, agreed to host the veterans of the 1943 Butterfly bomb raid. The event was scheduled for November, but the weather seemed determined to replicate the violence of the war itself. On the day of the parade, the North Sea wind howled across the streets, gusting up to 80 miles an hour. The weather was, simply put, diabolical. The planned parade, a final, proud march for men whose average age was now nearing 80, was immediately cancelled. The old officers, many feeling physically unable to fight the gale, were instead ferried in buses. It was a poignant symbol of their aging bodies contrasted with the enduring memory of their youthful invincibility. Later that day, gathered for the civic ceremony, the veterans received the long-delayed recognition. Mayor Norton addressed the room, his voice amplified over the rattle of the wind against the windows. He looked directly at the assembled officers. "On behalf of the people of Grimsby," he stated, "can I say how indebted we are to your skill and bravery? Your work 50 years ago in the town will always be remembered." The awards were presented, a formal acknowledgement of the service that had kept the town functioning under siege. Major Green, a George Medal recipient, stood alongside Wakeling. These were men who had faced down death together decades earlier, now sharing a moment of collective, public gratitude. But the true, visceral acknowledgement came later that evening. The veterans gathered at a local pub, seeking warmth and camaraderie after the day's official functions. They were dusty, tired, and still dressed in their khaki uniforms, the yellow bomb insignia, a faint, familiar beacon. The pub was crowded, filled with locals seeking refuge from the cold. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and loud conversation. As the small group of bomb disposal men entered, the noise of the crowded room did not immediately register. They were simply looking for a free table, a place to rest their aching legs. Then the conversations stopped. A profound, spontaneous silence fell over the entire pub. It was not the silence of fear, but of reverence. The locals, men and women who had been children during the 1943 raid, recognized the insignia. They recognized the men who had crawled through their streets, neutralizing the devices that had threatened their very existence. Without a word, the townspeople began to stand up. One by one, then in clusters, they vacated their seats and moved aside. They created a path to the best tables near the fire. They offered their spots to the veterans of the home front. It was a gesture of respect so raw and unexpected that it stunned the officers into stillness. Wakeling and his colleagues finally sat down, accepting the chairs. The moment was more profound than any medal, more resonant than any official speech. It was the absolute, unscripted gratitude of the people whose lives they had saved. One elderly gentleman approached their table, leaning in close. He didn't speak of tactics or fuses. He spoke only of a child's memory. "I remember the butterfly bombs," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He thanked them for clearing the streets 50 years prior. The veterans looked at each other, a shared, weary smile passing between them. The fear they had felt, the trembling hands, the cold sweat, the moments where the hair literally stood up on the back of their necks, had been worth it. They had been young, filled with a sense of youthful invincibility that only true danger could create. They had known the risks, but they had not expected to die. And in that crowded, suddenly quiet pub, surrounded by the grateful faces of the people they had protected, the unsung heroes of bomb disposal finally received their due. The long, lonely war was over, and the debt was finally paid. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.